Hey everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. Sorry about that. Last video, it just cuts off all of a sudden, so I'm just going to finish the video in this part 2 of the Populist Party. Just recall we're looking at the Omaha platform. This is really like the wish list that the farmers have, their demands that they make, and this is going to create the wish list for their political party, and they'll run their first presidential candidate in 1892, and by 1896 they're going to be merging with the Democratic Party. The system of sub-treasuries, we noted that already, abolition of a national bank. The bank and banks in general, the Eastern banks are problems for farmers. They see themselves as exploited by finance and by banks. The direct election of senators, this is something where at the time period, the typical voter does not vote for senator, only for House of Representatives, and senators are selected by other means within the states. So it is kind of a challenge for democracy. This ultimately does become part of the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, so it's something on the list that the farmers don't acquire during the populist movement of the 1890s, but it does come about later on, not too long after this time. The farmers are also seeking government ownership of railroads, telegraph companies. Kind of taking what we would maybe today classify as like utility companies and putting them under the control of government. And keep in mind, this is a time of incredible hands-off government. This is just not how the federal government has been involved in corporations or in regulating corporations. So if you keep in mind the President Cleveland source, which basically says, hey, the federal government, isn't going to do something like help farmers have access to seeds or any of those things. It's just not the role of the federal government. This number 4 becomes pretty significant, in light of that. We see a strain of nativism in the populist movement. It's important, when we talk about modern populism, so like radical right-wing populist movements. Some people have suggested even Donald Trump, was someone who was articulating issue with the side effects of globalization, but blaming some lost jobs and whatnot on immigrant groups. And so we've seen nativism as attached to populism in our modern times too. To some degree, we see that in the turn of the century version of populism. A lot of concern about immigrants taking jobs, and this idea of populists kind of being all about the common man. There really is, in a sense, this like definitional aspect of like who is the common man and who fits and who doesn't fit. So, all of these modern day discussions about diversity and inclusion and some of those things, this is happening in the time period. This is, during the Jim Crow time in the South, and some of the, nativism, is fitting into some of that mindset too, that we know is commonplace. And there's other nativist strains outside of populism too. It's pretty significant in this time period. 8-hour workday for government employees. This is something to appeal to some of the workers and the industrial workers in particular. Abolition of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, getting rid of those strike breakers. A secret ballot, kind of like the direct election of senators. Ballots did not need to be secret. So before this time period, and really before the 17th Amendment passes a little bit later on, voting everybody can know who you vote for. So if you're in a space and you're, being targeted for who you vote for, everybody knows. And so this is like a democratic thing. The remonetization of silver. Farmers are sometimes going to miss, in a sense, some of the big picture about why their prices are so low. They'll end up wishing to create inflation rather than outright printing funds like some earlier movements might have been interested in doing, the farmers look to help out some of the silver miners and remonetize silver. At this time, currency is actually backed up by gold. So you could go into a bank with your currency and exchange it for the equivalent in gold. So the value of currency would change dependent on the value of gold. Today, our Federal Reserve notes are not backed up by bullion at all. They're not pegged to anything. It's just our faith in the dollar, that supports, the value of money. But farmers are going to seek adding money to the money supply. Basically, what the Federal Reserve Bank does today in making interest rates, lower or higher, they're kind of adding to or taking out money. And now we have inflation, so the Federal Reserve is looking to raise interest rates, so the money supply is a little bit smaller. Farmers wanted to make it bigger, basically create inflation so that they would have higher prices for the goods that they sold. This was probably not going to be the best solution to their problem, but this is what farmers were demanding. They also are seeking single terms. In 1892, there is some popular vote that goes to the populist candidate, and you can see, where that's coming from: Nevada, Colorado, Kansas, etc., and they win some portion of the electoral vote, about 9%. The bimetallism issue is the big issue. So of all these things that are on the list, the one that really captures the populists is this issue of creating some degree of inflation by making silver part of the money supply. And, silver at one time had been part of the money supply. It was, then it wasn't, and it's kind of brought out of circulation through a series of acts under Cleveland. And, there is this huge debate about whether or not it's going to be exclusively gold or silver is going to be, allowed to stick around. And this is the big issue. Of course, in 1893, there's this massive panic. It starts 10 days after Cleveland took office. Sometimes it is, compared sometimes to 2008. In a lot of corporations went bankrupt. About 16,000 businesses disappeared. The stock market crashes. This is largely due to overextension of investments in the railroad industry. And there's a whole bunch of bank failures, a contraction of credit. Basically the economy is going to shrink. It had been overextended. It's going to shrink a great deal. And by 1895, 2 years into this panic, unemployment has reached 3 million people. So it's a really significant panic. This is one of the things that's going to cause the Republican Party to really seek outlets to address this. And it's also going to add some fuel to the fire about some of the things that the populists are saying. Their crisis is reaching like significant issues. And, the government, in response to the 1893 panic, is largely continuing its laissez-faire policies, right? And we know that, gold is in short supply. There's a whole bunch of economic issues related to what's happening. And there is a, kind of crisis with the economic panic of 1893 that sets up the farmers, even more so to create some reforms. And this is like there's songs, there's movements, political cartoons. When the banker says he's broke and the merchant's up in smoke, they forget it's the farmer who feeds them all. So the farmers kind of launching into this campaign that they are very significant and they're being, marginalized by the rest of society. We see other movements too. This is Coxey's Army, a group that is going to march, to the federal government. And it's different than the populists, but related. A group of, basically individuals who are fighting for jobs, marching to Washington. People see this as like radical at the time. The movement of the Wizard of Oz is kind of connected to this idea of Coxey's Army marching to Washington, which is kind of like the Wizard of Oz. There's actually a book by Frank Baum that comes out in this time period called the Wizard of Oz, and it is really the an allegory for the populist movement. there is the industrial worker in the form of the Tin Man, the Scarecrow, who's kind of representing the farmer, and he's supposed to be like really dumb and he wants a brain, but of course he's the one who figures everything out. So he's like smart all along. He asked for a brain. Of course, he always had one. So there's this like, kind of description of the populist movement as they take the Yellow Brick Road to go to, Oz to basically request, and Oz is, so bright in the book that you can't go near it. You have to wear special glasses and, all those kinds of things. The outcome of this election of 1896 is significant for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Populist Party is ready to run its own candidate again and to actually try to win as a third party. So this could be significant in the election of 1896. However, William Jennings Bryan, who's young, he's like a 36-year-old, filled with like great oration, he starts to take on some of the issues of the populists, but rather than running for the Populist Party, he runs for the Democratic Party. This is an image of him from the time. You can see his like oratory style is kind of like big deal. He is making a case, and he talks about the issue of free silver. There's a belief that in the Wizard of Oz, he would be represented by the lion. He was referred to that way. But the populace, in seeing this Democratic Party candidate who's going wild talking about the need for free silver, they start to put their eggs into the Democratic Party basket. And there's actually this concept that, the Populist Party and the Democratic Party will fuse. And it comes out of Bryant's Cross of Gold speech, where he really links himself to the needs of the common man. He speaks a lot about anti-elitism. He talks about the banks, and he says, you shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. So he makes it like the wealthy classes are indeed in favor of gold, for their own benefit. And this whole currency thing of free silver is like a really big, almost like symbolic deal. Like, whose side are you on? Kind of the commercial class or the common man. The way that you would signify that was by being either gold for the commercial class or free silver, 16 to 1, having 16 to 1, the ratio of silver to gold. That's something that the common man seeks. William Jennings Bryan will actually lose the election, despite the fact that he travels the whole entire country. He loses the election, and McKinley will win. There's lots and lots of antagonism within the Democratic Party that the populists have kind of hijacked the party, and now it's lost. And a Republican comes into office. William McKinley is going to take the country directly to the gold standard, which it'll be on for many, many, many decades. So that's really the significant thing. The Democratic Party had fought for a reduction in the tariff, the income tax, stricter control of trusts, especially railroads, and free silver. We're going to see William McKinley become the individual who is going to be really, really, focused on the opposite of that, pro tariffs and pro gold and pro commercial interests. William McKinley will be the third president to be shot after Lincoln and after Garfield, another president. McKinley is shot, and the person who will come into office after McKinley will be Teddy Roosevelt, who was put in the vice presidency largely to kind of keep him in a space. He was becoming a very active politician in New York. People were interested in some cases in quieting him down. That's not going to work out too well. So we'll look at some of that next time.